I don't know where you're at right now in your life, what season it is or what period you're going through. But maybe you're in a time where you feel completely isolated. Maybe you feel isolated even though there are people around you, but you feel they just don't understand what you're going through. They don't get it. Maybe you're isolated more on a physical level because you have literally moved away and you are not with the familiar people, the familiar places that you've always been with, the things that you've relied on. Or maybe you feel isolated because of personal things that you're going through. So internal and emotional. And you know that you're struggling with these things. And the people around you, the familiar people, the familiar places, they just seem to carry on as if life is fine. And you're in that place, in that season of just looking from the inside out and saying, sure, you guys just don't get it. You just don't understand where I'm at. And you feel so alone. But what happens if we look at isolation, not as a setback? If we look at isolation and say, even though this might feel heavy, and yes, it definitely feels different, but what happens if isolation has a very specific purpose in God's plan in our lives, and that He knows exactly how He wants to use it? Because there are things that happen when we feel alone like that are not going to happen in other times and in other places. And that's where our isolation can be seen not as a punishment, but as preparation and purging for the season that God knows is coming. So when we look and we say, if I can navigate through these patches in my life and I can get the most out of them, that I'm not going to waste the hurt. I'm going to make sure that I take all of this to the Lord and I find out exactly what His plan is. And so all the different kinds of isolation that we can have, whether those are external or internal, whether it is circumstances or whether it's your own deep personal work that you're having to deal with. It could be a crisis within your family that makes you feel ashamed and that you want to withdraw from everybody that you know. It could be your own moral failure. It could be financial difficulties that you're facing. It could be health issues. It could be a breakup of a relationship or just a change of relationship. And this is the part that I find so fascinating is isolation creeps up on us. It's not something that we're like, oh yes, no, I'm going to feel isolated. You only feel it when you're there. And sometimes it's circumstances or changes that you might not think will result in that feeling. Something as simple as getting married. That's a huge change. So you're going to leave all of the knowns, and yes, it's exciting, and so you might not want to feel like, oh, why do I feel these feelings? Or maybe becoming a parent. So being a first-time mom, and all of a sudden your whole life changes, and you can't undo that change, and you wouldn't want to, but yet you have to deal with those feelings. And so it's in those times that I just want you to know that God does some incredible work, and that we can start looking forward to that. Because whenever we face loss, it brings a perspective that nothing else is going to bring. And whatever that loss might be like, no matter how it happens, and you feel like you're in exile, you've been cut off and left alone to figure things out, you just have to remind yourself, you are never, ever alone. So like all of the biblical examples that we have, if we go look, and I really want to encourage you to subscribe to our email, because we're going to be looking at those biblical characters and sharing links about their stories for you to go through so that you can connect with them. But when we look at those characters and we say, okay, so how do I relate? What is it that they went through? Almost every single great biblical story that you know is preceded by a period of isolation. So we have to be able to look at that and say, okay, so before Joseph was Joseph, oh wow, he's in a pit, he's in prison, he's all alone. Then he becomes 2IC of Egypt. Before Moses becomes the leader of the entire nation of Israel, well, he's in a desert all alone. Before Paul starts writing the New Testament just about and planting churches all over, he's also in a desert for 3 years, undergoing preparation. Before the Lord started his ministry on earth, he was in the desert all alone. And so we can't ignore this pattern. And then that should give us hope and inspiration and encouragement that when we feel isolated, it's okay. Because in that silence, God draws us closer to himself. So we can see, and isolation has this great purpose, but why does it feel so hard? Like, why is it so difficult for us to go through it? And that's because even though loss brings perspective, it might not be the perspective that we want right now. It's going to bring us what we need, but not always what we want. Because in times of loss, we are stripped away from so many other distractions. And don't be fooled, they're not just distractions. They are comfy blankets. They bring us something. That's why we have them. And to have those all taken away, well, it starts making us feel uneasy. But here's the good news, is it gets us to focus on what truly matters. So when everything familiar is gone, well, then we have two options. I'm either going to go towards despair, or I'm going to lean in and start depending on the Lord. And those are the moments where I'm like, okay, how much time am I going to spend here in the darkness and the despair and the pity and the victimhood? And how much time is it going to take for me to see, okay, hang on, God is still working. My feelings might not change, but my perspective can. And then I can see the great work that he is going to do. Because in those times, that's when it's highlighted to us so clearly that we often are relying on the wrong things. So we are placing our identity, our value, our worth, whatever we think is truly important in life, well, we've put value in areas that it shouldn't be. And one of the great Bible stories is about Elijah. And Elijah was a prophet at a very difficult time in the nation of Israel's history. And he fought against like hundreds of false prophets of Baal. And it's this epic battle. And he comes out victorious from it, like in the most amazing way. And you can just think how powerful he must have felt. And then Queen Jezebel says, Elijah, I'm going to get you and I'm going to kill you. So he's just fought hundreds and hundreds of these false prophets. And then the one lady, the one woman says, okay, now I'm going to get you. And he runs. He's afraid. And he's isolated in a cave all alone. And God reveals himself to him. And God does it in such a beautiful way. He reveals himself through this massive earthquake, through like this huge wind, and through fire. And in all of those, Elijah doesn't find the comfort that he needs. And then the scriptures tell us that Elijah heard the Lord in a whisper. And that's when God drew Elijah closer to himself. Because that's what happens with a whisper, is I have to get close. I have to lean in to hear what you're saying. And that's often what God does in those moments, is he draws us to himself so that we get to know him in a way and rely on him in a way that we have never before. And we see that all the other things that maybe we did place value in, maybe that we were relying on, that those things actually are not the essence of where my strength comes from and my comfort and my peace. And so I can then understand that it's in that silence. It's when I feel isolated and alone from everything else that I find that I'm never truly alone, because God is with me in a way that nothing else can be. So if isolation is going to bring that, maybe we also just need to touch on the fact that there is a price that we are paying for being so busy all the time. There is a hidden cost that we're not aware that we're paying. So if my life is constantly busy and if I keep distracting myself with all of these little things, well, that's when I have to see the deep work is not going to happen, because the distractions keep me at a shallow level and deep work is never going to happen there. I have to be willing to let go of all of those and then allow God to work. That is the invitation that isolation brings. So when the psalmist writes and he says, be still and know that I am God. When God says that in Psalm 46, Why is it that we find Him in the stillness? Well, it's because we have to first let go of all the other things. And then we find that that is the deeper work. When the external noise is removed, it helps us to focus on the internal work that God wants to do. So instead of viewing isolation as a pause, as this huge setback in our lives, we need to be able to see that as a season of refinement and a season of God doing such great work, so that we can eventually start embracing isolation. And I know that sounds so weird. It sounds like, Warren, like you're trying to put a positive spin on something that's supposed to be negative. And I'm saying, I know it's tough. I know exactly what it feels like to feel absolutely alone, that you can't go to anybody, even though you have people around you. And that people would be disappointed that you didn't rely on them, that you didn't ask them. I know what it feels like. But it's in those moments that I have found, that's when I go and I speak to the Lord in a way that I don't speak to Him normally. It's not just my every morning prayer. It's not my every evening just touching in with God. No, now it's, Lord, like I'm so desperate. I have no one else except you. And that's a great place to be. So that's what isolation is going to be. It's going to change your perspective. So instead of seeing it as an enemy, we ask the question, Lord, what do you want to teach me in this season? And thankfully, we know that the season doesn't last forever. It's going to change. And that is the exciting part of it. That when I'm facing a season where I feel completely isolated, I can see it as preparation. So when God is able to build those deep relationships in the quiet, that means that I'm going to be able to rely on Him with that same relationship in the next season. You don't lose it. What you gain in the times of isolation, you take with you into the next season. And then I can be ready for whatever it is that God has prepared me for. So each of those biblical characters, you could never tell their story if you remove the isolation first, because they would not be the same person. The lessons that Moses and Paul and Joseph, and you can run through the whole list. David tending the sheep all on his own. Who's he relying on? Well, he's not relying on his brothers or anybody else. He's relying on the Lord, and that's what he needs for the season that's coming, and that's what God knows. And that's all he's asking. He's asking, will you just trust me? Will you just trust me that I know what I'm doing, and I need to do this work now with you because of what is coming? And then I can accept the process in a completely different way, because isolation creates depth. It allows God to do work beneath the surface, the deep work where you don't see visible growth, but it's the work, it's the roots that have to be there. Isolation also clarifies our calling. So it makes me know that when the distractions are removed and I can hear God calling clearly, and I can know deep within my spirit that this is what God wants me to do. And it's right. And there's nothing else that I would rather do. And that kind of clarity, what's that worth? Well, it's definitely worth a season of isolation. And that deepens my faith. And that allows me to trust God in that silence, in an unshakable way, so that when I do have to go and face the noise and the busyness and everything else, it doesn't take away that reliance and that dependence that I have. So instead of praying for isolation to end, instead of praying that a season of isolation and feeling alone and the feeling of nobody else understands, instead of asking that just disappears, rather let's change that prayer and say, Father, please give me clarity in this season. Do the work that you need to do in me. I'm willing. Because the sooner we allow Him to do that work, the sooner the season of isolation passes. And so I want to ask you these questions. In what area of your life do you feel isolated? if that is the season that you're in right now? Are you physically isolated, removed from the people that are your support? Do you maybe feel emotionally isolated that nobody understands? Maybe it's morally that you feel like you're facing something that you can't let other people know about, and that keeps you away from them. Whatever that season or that feeling of isolation is, just acknowledge it, name it, and say, okay, that's how I'm feeling. And then allow the Lord to work through it. Because then you get to ask, well, what are the distractions that God has removed in this season? What are the things that I'm not having to deal with, that I used to deal with, but right now they have no interest? What deep work have I been avoiding that now it's possible for me to work on? And then we want to go and have a look. Who in the scriptures can I relate to? Whose story speaks to my situation? How can I see that God worked in them and then He worked through them in such a beautiful way? So when we speak about being set apart for God's word, so we use Christian terms, we say we're holy or we're sanctified, and that's the process, the refining work that God does. That is the call for every single believer. It is for us to be made more like Christ, so that our character reflects Him more, and ourselves and our selfishness and our sin less. Now, that entire process is a process of isolation. It's calling you out of the world that you once knew. It's calling you away from the things that have always held you back. It's setting you apart for God's work and for Him to work in your character in a way that nothing else can. So when we can see that isolation plays such an important part in our character development, in who God is making us and who He wants us to be, I'm not saying that we're going to face isolation and it's going to feel great and we're going to walk around with this huge smile on our faces. I'm still saying, yes, it's going to take deep work, and often deep work is difficult work. And often that deep work brings with it some negative emotions that we have to face up to. But how beautiful it is to know, not only are you never alone, but it's in those times that you are building on your relationship that shows you that there is actually only one person that you need, and only one person that you should be depending on, and that is the Lord. And when you've got that strong, well, then you can face the world and conquer giants. You can lead nations, and you can change history, and you can live out the life that God has called you to live. So I really just want to encourage you. And as I encourage you, I'm encouraging myself. In seasons of isolation, let's change our perspective and let's change our prayers. Let's say, Lord, not take this away. Why am I so alone? Let's rather say, Lord, teach me. Show me what you want to. And show me how close you are to me. Because I know that you are going to do great work. And so I pray that you will be encouraged. And I pray that you will be able to encourage others who perhaps are in difficult seasons to know that God is always with us and that God is always working in us, working His great plan.